Hi, EDL 553 friends. I hope that everyone's having a good Labor Day holiday weekend. I wanted to check in with my response to your 1 minute papers. And this might be a little bit of a lengthy video because I've got a few things that I want to explain to you in response to some consistent questions that I received on your papers. So one of the first questions that I received was how do I decide which readings to focus on? An individual asked from the class asked this question, and unfortunately, I don't know that I have really a very good answer for this. I choose the things that I want you to read for class, um, not because I think that some of them are essential and others of them are just things that you might find interesting. I think they're all important to your learning, and so I want to encourage you to read everything and then to even look and to dig for more things to read that I've not provided you. Um, as a strategy, I think the things that I would make sure that I read and focus on and have a strong grasp of would be the material in the SHU textbook, the required book for the course, but certainly the other pieces as well. Um, in terms of strategies that have worked for me for reading and managing reading content in graduate school, um, note taking and not trying to read and underline everything. I think sometimes you highlight or underline things in a book, and it almost becomes so overwhelming and so hard to actively focus on what it is that you've highlighted because sometimes it really can be difficult to kind of to perceive what's important. Um, if you've highlighted so many things, and I'm guilty of having done that in the past. A strategy that I find that's worked well for me has been to take notes, particularly where things are defined or a particular process is explained, and maybe not focus so much on why the author is saying, why this is important. Um, but if a concept or a term is explained, I think that's important. If how to do something is explained or is outlined, I think an outline of that can be really helpful as well. Um, Another strategy, if managing volume, particularly with multiple courses, is an issue for you, I think could be doing reading groups and where you divide up, who's going to really be kind of responsible for which particular readings and you create your own summaries and share those back and forth, and then that way you've got the knowledge. Everyone's kind of shared in the work. Everyone's helped to kind of summarize the knowledge, and it gives you kind of a cram sheet. I guess the good news is this is not a program where we do much, if any, quizzing or testing on reading. Um, but I do think, my colleagues and I choose things for you to read because we think that it's important stuff for you to know. Um, and, we want your graduate experience to be a robust intellectual experience as well as one that is robust intellectually so that you can apply what it is that you learn in the classroom in a work or real life environment, which is, I think, a big part of the point anyway. So the reading continues to be important. I'm sorry that I don't have perhaps better advice, but those are some strategies that I might suggest to you. So, got a lot of questions. No, not a lot, but maybe 3 out of 9, which feels like a lot, on the distinctions between program, decision, and participant-oriented assessment approaches, and they're still unclear to me. So what I'm going to propose to do here, or attempt to do here, is to give you some definitions and when to use the common types, when to use, well, we've covered that already, and a little bit of, why we care about these assessment approaches, why we care about them and maybe how we use them. So the first one that you were responsible for the last class session was the program-oriented approaches. And with program-oriented approaches, we typically are engaging in a process where you as the assessment team, you're learning as much as you possibly can about the key components or areas of a program and their expected outcomes. And that should sound somewhat familiar from class on last Wednesday. And using that knowledge to generate assessment questions to inform your assessment project or your assessment work. And examples of this would be objectives-oriented program approaches or assessment approaches rather, which ask to what extent does the activity achieve the objectives? And once you outline what those objectives or standards of performance are, you then use the data that are collected to decide what part of the program to improve, change, or terminate based on how those objectives are being met. And this is pretty essential to a lot of the projects that I think that you're going to be doing, particularly those that are campus-based, and that there may be some pre-existing objectives. I'm thinking particularly about the assessment of student employment programs. They probably already have a sense for what they want students to learn. And your assessment is evaluating or is assessing the degree to which those objectives are being achieved. A theory-driven approach is one that tests the theories or the ideas of the program operation, and it's typically you're looking at the theory of how the program as it's planned is supposed to work, and what it's supposed to achieve. And if there's any sort of failure of achievement of the stated outcomes, you either look at, was it a failure of implementation in terms of how we executed the program, how we completed the program, or did we fail in how we theorized that the program was going to work anyway? But those are two examples of program-oriented approaches. Decision-oriented approaches are those that focus on decision points instead of meeting objectives. And you can kind of think of it as being somewhat of a pro-con, where you as the person who's doing the assessment might help the client or the stakeholder thinking about the program. What are the pros and cons if I do this versus that? What's likely to happen if I make this decision to move in this direction versus move in this direction or in another direction with this decision-making process. And it's very much designed or described as being a close collaborative process between those doing the assessment and stakeholders or with clients. The textbook describes the SIP, context input process product approach, or the UFE, the utilization focused approach, where context in the SIP approach is assessing the context of where things are happening to see what sort of needs might exist and what sort of plans might be needed to help meet those needs. Examining inputs, so after you determine the needs, focusing on how to leverage organizational resources that might be human resources or otherwise to meet the needs through the input of others. So it's both physical resources as well as gathering input, gathering feedback from other people. Taking a look at process, focusing on the process of implementation to incorporate others' ideas, build support, ward off threats, etc. And then finally, coming in at the end and doing an assessment of product. How well did the program meet needs and what should be done to improve it? UFE, or the utilization focused evaluation or assessment in our case, it's focused on using results to inform specific decisions, especially through involvement of one or more key stakeholders. The idea in UFE is that involving stakeholders in positions of authority, that is users, makes them more interested and invested in the results, and then therefore more likely to use the results in rendering decisions about the program. And of course, these stakeholders that get involved in this process are usually going to be stakeholders in positions of authority. So typically a manager type, someone who has responsibility for the program, or someone who has funding responsibilities for the program. Participant-oriented approaches. So these are kind of the last of the three groups, and they really are approaches that seek to empower stakeholders and use or share stakeholder knowledge in the assessment process. Stakeholders might be involved at just the beginning and end only, and where stakeholders might be involved at the beginning and end is helping to frame out what the main questions are that will be answered by the assessment, as well then at the end in interpreting results and helping to flesh out what implications and recommendations are. Or stakeholders could be involved throughout the process, where they're involved both in framing the questions as well as the interpretation of results and making recommendations, but also at various points throughout in terms of being sources of data, being active actual participants in the assessment process. And the two examples that I'll highlight from the text that I think might be most relevant are the practical, participatory, and the empowerment approaches to assessment. Um, Practical participatory um, involves stakeholders throughout the assessment process, and it's more of a balanced approach where the stakeholders and the people who are doing the assessment have an equal role or equal authority. The stakeholders might help to guide or lead the assessment team in certain activities, but the assessment team also must take responsibility for doing the same. They can't really concede authority for the assessment process. Otherwise, it's kind of like it's a little bit of like the rooster ruling the hen house, or whatever the saying is. You have the people that should be kind of part of the accountability process and the assessment, kind of telling you, well, look at this thing, but don't look over here where we might have something actually going on that we don't want you to know about. So you have to be careful not to concede too much authority or power to stakeholders or people who are kind of directly involved in the process, or else you could wind up missing some things that you don't want to miss. And the practical participatory approach is used to make formative or improvement-oriented decisions, typically not ever final decisions on a program or product or process that's being assessed. The empowerment approach relies very heavily on stakeholder involvement, typically throughout, particularly downstream stakeholders, which might be program staff, some program managers, particularly if program managers are not necessarily terribly empowered to make a lot of decisions, but have what's referred to as responsibility without authority, but particularly other folks downstream, so end users of a product or end users of a program. And you invest time and effort in getting stakeholder input and buy-in, typically where none has previously existed. That's the empowerment aspect. And it's used mostly to build mechanisms for internal accountability, for internal improvement within programs, but also to give voice to the voiceless to some degree in the assessment process. So if you go back and you listen to this again, if you feel so inclined, or if you simply kind of just read through the 3 chapters, what I think you'll see is that there are some significant overlaps among the different approaches, among program, participant, and decision-oriented approaches. And as I pointed out in the slideshow, there are specific types within program, within participant, and within decision-oriented. And they're not discrete approaches. They share characteristics, they share commonalities throughout. What you want to do is to decide which one of these different kinds of approaches most closely matches what it is that you're doing in your assessment, and then be able to write about that. Or which one might, as opposed to saying we're doing this is the one that matches, you might say, based on what it is that we're trying to achieve in our assessment, which one of these approaches is the model that we'd like to follow. And then, to the degree to which you're able, essentially as best you can, follow those kinds of steps in conducting and doing your assessment. And you'll write about that in your proposal, looking a little bit at some of the historical development and application and use, and can certainly draw upon the materials that were provided for you in the module to learn more about that, to inform your writing about those approaches. So lastly, everyone seemed to be kind of at a 5, which was exciting. I didn't see anyone who scored their group process at this point anything less than a 5. So it sounds like people are doing well, and I'm excited about that. We can certainly talk more about these issues of assessment approaches when we see each other again a week from this coming Wednesday. But otherwise, I hope that you have had a great Labor Day weekend and are doing super well. And I will look forward to visiting with you when I see you on campus. All right, take care.